everyone, welcome to my channel, and today I'm gonna be talking about how our environment during our very early years of growing up can shape who we are later in life. So if you're interested in topics of science, of brain, psychology, then keep watching. So recently I actually read this really interesting book which is written by David Eagleman, who's a neuroscientist, and The Brain, the Story of You. And I think this book just gives really nice and very simple perspective on how the environment that we're growing up, how that environment can actually shape who we are later in life. And that's why I thought that maybe I would just make this really quick video about maybe a few interesting aspects that he talks about. So initially he starts talking about how as humans, when we are born, how we can't talk, can't walk, we can't feed really ourselves as much except drinking milk. And then he compares that, and then because of that as well, we are very dependent on our parents, on our caregivers. And then he compares that with other mammals who, most of the mammals, when they are born, they already know how to swim, they already know how to walk. So if we compare ourselves to other mammals at this very early stages of when we are born, it seems like we are quite undeveloped. We are really disadvantaged in that sense, because there's still a lot of learning that we have to do before we can even walk or before we can do any basic things for ourselves. But actually this is a disadvantage to other mammals because they are being born pre-programmed to do certain things. So for example, if they're going to be born in different environment, then perhaps they will have much lower chances to survive in this environment because they wouldn't be able to adapt as easily because they are just pre-programmed to certain things, and that's the limitation. Where we as humans, when we are born, we adapt to the environment. So depending where we are born, we can easily adapt to that, and that will be then the advantage of not being perhaps pre-programmed. So perhaps by being pre-programmed to do certain things, it gives less flexibility. So as David Eagleman, he said in his book, we are actually born with unfinished brain. So the wiring in our brains haven't been completed yet, and that gives us this flexibility to adapt to the environment depending where we are born, within what families we are born, and that really will then have an impact on how our brains are going to be wired, what skills we're gonna acquire. The number of brain cells in young children and adults are fairly the same, but what's different about our brains, we look at the brain of like really young child and an adult, are the connections between specific neurons. So when we are born, and if we look at the brain structure, then we can see that there's plenty of neurons, but they're much less connected. There's less connections there's less synapses between specific neurons. But with time, that starts to increase. So in the first 2 years of our life, there's actually really rapid increase in those connections. So we produce about 2 million of those synapses every second of our life. But then what's happened, the process of pruning is starting. And during this process, certain connections which perhaps we don't use are discarded, and only those connections that we use are being left. So for example, if in that period of time the child's gonna start maybe hearing certain noises, certain sounds of certain languages, those connections, they're gonna stay. So the synapses that we're gonna be using, they're gonna become stronger, means the information gonna be able to pass quicker from one neuron to the other. And those synapses that we're not going to be using, they're going to be discarded. So if we are not exposed to certain things in this very early stages of our life, that will really have impact on how our brain is shaped. In his book, David Eagleman, he really talks a lot about what happens to the brain if the brain in this very early stages of life is not exposed to love and care. And then he gives example of orphanages in Romania where children, they have been left for months and years without any nurturing, any love, only their physical needs, so feeding, dressing, all those needs that were met. And then he explains, what impact that had, that most of the children, they just end up with suffering with severe learning disabilities. So in 60s in Romania, there was a pressure to increase the country population, and therefore people, they were asked to have at least 5 children. There was even some taxes put on people who actually have less than 5 children. But what happened a few years later, people, they actually really struggled to care for these children. They had no resources. So they actually abandoned the children, and those children, they have been put in orphanages. In late 80s, there was already 170,000 abandoned children in those institutions. And soon after that, actually, people, they start realizing like what consequences it had on those children being raised in those institutions without any care and love. And in 2005, actually, it was banned to actually place children under 2 years old in those institutions. So in this institute, people actually who work there, they might actually have like 15 children under themselves. So, only one caregiver and 15 little infants or toddlers. So you can imagine like what care those children they've received. And they were actually instructed not to hug the children and not express any emotions towards them. So yes, they were fed, the nappies, they were changed, they were dressed, but perhaps to make everything more efficient, everything was really mechanized. So children, they wore the same clothes, they had the same haircut, they needed to eat the same food, the same routine for everyone. So there was definitely no space for nourishing their individuality. So Professor Charles Nelson, who's a professor of pediatrics in Boston, he actually done a research on children who actually been raised from birth up to 3 years old in those institutions. And he done the research based on, it was over 130 children. So one of the very few things that he initially noticed is that those children's IQs, they were really declined. And as well, the brain, they were undeveloped, and as well, the language skills, they were severely delayed. And also with EEG scans, they were able to see that the neural activities, that they were also severely declined in those children. So as a consequence, it was concluded that without love, nurturing, without cognitive stimulation, human brain can't develop to its full capacity. And Dr. Nelson, he also noticed that if these children are removed from those institutions on time, they can still perhaps recover. So perhaps children who were removed from those institutions before 2 years old, they were still able to catch up with other kids. But for example, if kids, they stayed there up to, they were maybe 6 years old, there were maybe certain things that they were maybe not able to recover, and they really suffer the consequences of that later on in life. So it might be something to do with speech or other learning capacities. So who we are as adults, it depends heavily on the environment that we are growing up as children. If you like this video, then like it and subscribe. And if you have any comments, any questions, then leave them in a comment section. Thank you. Bye.